Right, thanks, Gabor. This is probably the least interesting presentation of the entire 2 days, but it has to be done. So, I mean, in actual fact, there is some residual interest, in this because it's to do with the success of LDBC as an organization, and the things that I'm going to talk about are things that have been driven actually by our success in growing and also increasing the number of audits that have taken place of benchmarks, as Oscar was reporting earlier on. So the growth has led to us having a large number of organizational members. And organizational members in LDBC are the ones who have votes. And the way that's historically been done is we've had a board of directors, and everybody who wants to appoint a director to the board of directors, if they are an organizational member, could do so. That gave us a board of directors which was very large, and it's the kind of board of directors that is spread across the world in multiple jurisdictions. And when banks see organizations that don't make a profit and that have lots of directors and they're spread all over the world, they seem to interpret that as a clear indication that we are laundering money. And not only that, we're an incredibly dangerous organization because we're laundering £50,000 or $60,000 per annum. So, this is really we must stamp this out, right? So we were having trouble dealing with our banking relations. We didn't look very normal from the standpoint of our corporate structure. And none of that was interesting. All we wanted to do was do what we were doing, which was have our members come together and decide on matters of policy and strategy. And are we going to approve a new benchmark like the FinBench benchmark? Are we going to approve a new working group? Exactly what we've been doing in the past. And we also wanted to do the sort of everyday business of running LDBC as a small company and so forth. So we wanted to make some changes that would make us look more normal and be a little bit more streamlined in terms of our processes. So we adopted new articles of association, which is what you call the constitution of a company in the UK. And we effectively tried to simplify the way we were structured a bit and do some renaming and a little bit of rejigging of the responsibilities. So we wanted to take the opportunity to reflect the expansion of what LDBC does in our objectives or goals as an organization. So we're a non-profit organization, but we're structured as a company, and we have a statement about what our objects or goals are. And we've done a lot of work, as you've already been hearing, that isn't just about benchmarks, but it's about the sort of community around graph data management and the language standards in particular. And so we put references to that in the new version of the Constitution. We reduced our previous 4 classes of membership to 2, and there's voting members, which is basically companies, research institutions that pay money, and associate members who are individuals who are not part of one of the above, and they can take part in our activities for free. Then we took our steering committee, which was a group of 3 people, I think, and we turned it into the board of directors. And the board of directors can have between 3 and 5 directors. That's the maximum. The idea is hopefully we'll always have an odd number and be able to make decisions by majority easily. And we took our old board of directors, which, if you recall, were the people who decided to be directors and to take part in forming the policy of the company and so forth. And we turned that into something we're calling a members policy council. And we said also, let's tidy things up a bit so that the members policy council is allowed to approve things like LDBC standards. So LDBC is a standard setting organization for benchmark specifications. When we do things on the languages front, we're feeding into other standard setting organizations like WG3 or potentially W3C and so forth. And we wanted that to be something that the Members Policy Council could directly address rather than having to do a sort of formal vote of the entire membership of LDBC. And we also wanted to make the Members Policy Council be the group of people that would approve new voting members. So if you join LDBC as an organization, you fill in a form, you say, I'd like to join LDBC, and then we have a vote to make sure that everybody's happy that this company or organization is a reasonable fit, candidate for being a member of LDBC. We've never refused anybody, to my knowledge, who's applied to join LDBC. Why would you want to join this organization unless you wanted to launder money? Now, the other thing, so there's a slight sort of slight reallocation of responsibilities associated with that. The strategy, the policy, the broad direction of what we're going to do and how we're going to spend our limited amounts of money and so forth is for the Members Policy Council. The board, as you might expect, is to deal with the execution of that strategy, with our compliance and governance, to make sure we're doing things right, and our day-to-day management. And that includes the final decision on expenditure. And we're supposed to make sure that the board has the capacity to turn down a proposal from the Members Policy Council if it's mad or bad, if it's something that would actually get us into trouble, or we'd be carrying out a crime, or we'd be over trading so that we didn't have the money to do what we were trying to do. And however, the context of all of that is the members, that's to say the voting members, can remove the board and replace it with a new one. So it's pretty unlikely that the board is going to do something out of line with what the membership is interested in. So diagrammatically, voting members, associate members, pay fees, have votes, don't pay fees, don't have votes. Organizations can appoint a representative to the, it says MC, Members Council, Members Policy Council. And we've got also some individual board members who are voting members, and they individual members of LDBC who are voting members. This slide's slightly out of date. Peter, Gabor, Alexandru, I think, are the three people at present. That gives us the provision to have people who can't represent an organization but are important people for the work of LDBC, have played a significant role in its genesis or its guidance and so forth, and that certainly applies to all three of them. So that's where we sort of sit in terms of that picture. And just to remind you, Board of Directors, as it used to be, has become the Members Policy Council, and the Steering Committee has become a new small board. And the board, if you're a director, you're a member of the members, you have to be a member of the Members Policy Council, so it's like a subcommittee. I'm going to stop there to see, has anybody got any questions about the corporate restructuring of LDBC? Yes.
It may not be about that directly, but I'm really curious about how you deal with intellectual property of members.
Well, we have, you should have been at the last meeting a year ago, because then we were talking about that, I think, probably. So we've been going through this kind of progression of trying to professionalize LDBC, make it, better founded, make sure it's well founded financially, and it's got the right kinds of policies to be able to do what it's supposed to do. And one part of that, which we dealt with a couple of years ago now, or maybe 3 years ago even, was our intellectual property policies. So the intellectual property policies you could summarize as follows. For all software developments associated with work of LDBC, we have a contributor's license, which is effectively an Apache software license 2.0. And that can either be entered into as a collective agreement. You can enter into a collective license for an organization or an individual contributor. If you join as a member, you first of all sign up to the contributor agreement, which is about software, but you also subscribe to our intellectual property policies in terms of contributions you make, which are not software contributions. What that primarily means is if there are documentary contributions, papers, proposals about, anything that we might be working on, one could come to patents. If you make those kind of contributions, you are giving us a copyright license with a right to sub-license your contributions. So that's part of the deal. You join LDBC, you work on our collaborative platforms and so forth, and you allow your contributions to be put into the mix. What we don't do is automatically then sub-license those to the world. The reason we have that, we have some flexibility about that, is we wanted to make sure that we could control the way in which contributions that have come into LDBC go out to other organizations like WG3. So if we're contributing to a standards organization, we need to be able to make sure we are fitting in with their copyright policies and they can see what's actually taking place here. And that might mean that we are not going to immediately open source contributions that have been made to us. In general, however, our very strong prejudice, and it's sort of codified in our bylaws, is the work of LDBC is supposed to be public. It's supposed to be openly accessible. As much as possible, we want it to be freely accessible and shared with the entire world on a no-cost basis and without any kind of, so no royalties and so forth. As part of your agreement on making non-code contributions, there is a patent policy. And the patent policy is very similar to those that you would see from other standard setting organizations. We have two aspects to it. One is voluntary, which is that we request members to notify us as soon as possible if they see something happening being contributed by anybody that they think might infringe a patent. And so that the people who are involved in the work will find out as soon as possible about the possibility of a patent infringement. If there is a situation where an organization knows that they have a patent and that patent would be infringed by something that's being developed by LDBC, then they have an obligation to tell us that that exists. And they can, if they wish, make a standard patent license grant for the purposes of implementing whatever it is that we are creating. Example, the FinBench benchmark. Ant Group declared that they did have a patent that would be infringed if you implemented the proposed FinBench standard. And then they made a standard license grant for the purpose of implementing FinBench, which would waive or give you the right to actually infringe, not infringe their patent. So they made a patent license grant. So the idea, and this is a completely sort of standard way that patents are dealt with by standards organizations. You don't ask people to just make a license grant to the entire world for any purpose at all, although they're always free to do that. But you do ask them to license it for the purposes of the implementation of the standard that's being produced. So hopefully the combination of these things leads to early notification of problematic, potentially, standards essential patents that could be infringed. If you know about them, then you can avoid them. So one of the things you can do is then walk around the patent and say, well, we're not going to have that feature in our standard. Or if you've got people who are really wanting to make the thing happen, they'll do what Ant Group did and they'll clear the way by actually, operating on that. So screen sharing has stopped. Do I go back to there or to there?
No, it's this has slipped
out. It's me. I've probably been putting resting my hand on the cable or something.
I think we are good to reshare.
We should be okay.
Desktop 2 again, and yeah, recording is on.
Okay, great. Does that answer your question?
It does. W3C went through a lot of kind of like internal soul searching about 20 years ago, and basically requires members, if they want their patent data standard, to be royalty-free rather than the usual sort of reasonable and non-discriminatory rights.
And our standard patent license is royalty-free, and the standards specialist lawyers of Oracle and Intel were both involved, along with our lawyers, in the discussion of doing this. And they'd all been involved in W3C and seen N versions of it. So it's very similar. If you're familiar.
Design with the new patent policy.
Right.
And some companies, like I worked at Nokia, we almost resigned, but then.
I think this is kind of steadied down as being a sort of standard sort of thing, and the patent policy of ISO is very similar to this. And so there's a register, and you can see where things have been notified, and then you can decide what you think about it. I mean, we don't force. Just to recall, we don't force anybody to make such a patent license grant. The reaction to knowing about a patent, knowing it would be infringed, and having something in the standard that makes that infringement inevitable, is most likely you change the standard so that you don't have an infringement forced upon implementers. So it's all about visibility. It's about people being confident that if they take one of our benchmark standards, that they will not be facing this kind of situation. And equally, if we contribute into WG3, for example, around the language front, we need to make sure that we're passing in contributions which are not tainted from a patent perspective, so that WG3 can have the same assurance.
Are you familiar with the Kronos group? They're handling patents?
No.
OpenGL, OpenCL, again, one addition to what you just said that's interesting.
Right.
Companies agree that there is a notification period.
Yep.
If they miss that notification period, they're not allowed to come back later. Because what you worry about is you release a standard and then some, we ran into this.
We have
some company comes back 2 years later and goes, oh, wait a minute, there's a patent there.
Yeah.
And so in the Kronos group, they have it spelled out very clearly that you have a fixed period of time to notify, and if you miss that, then you lose the right.
W3C has the same.
Yeah.
We have a delay period, and we've got some provisions around that. I mean, ultimately, you can't make people license patents, right? You know, and you can't avoid the situation that a patent may be in existence that nobody knows about, which is infringed by a standard. I mean, that's just, you know. And what we don't do is we don't oblige our members to do patent searches. So if you're a big company like an Oracle or an Intel or whatever, we don't say you must search your patent database in order to work out whether or not you've got something running here. But it turns out this presentation has more interest in it than I thought was going to be the case. In any event, so let me move on to the second part, which is to do with our fair use policy. So this is a one slide excerpted from a slide set that I think Gabor and I originally created, going back to quite a long time it's taken us to do this. Anyway, so what we were saying was, we've got a graph data market with a growing number of vendors, and credible benchmark results have increasing values to customers, analysts, acquirers, and vendors. And we've certainly seen that actually be the case in practice. And we want to encourage unrestricted use for non-commercial research purposes, and I'll come back to that. We want to encourage internal use, which is substantial, private use for quality or performance testing by vendors of our standards, and we want to encourage the publication of audited results by commercial companies. To remind you, the whole philosophy of LDBC's benchmark specifications and the rules around the use of them is to reflect the learnings and the practice that was developed by the Transaction Processing Council, TPC, going way back to the 80s, I guess, in terms of the genesis of this work. And you can, I think there's a book by Jim Gray that described the motivations and so on and so forth. And what we're trying to do is get tricky, complex, demanding testing specifications from a technical perspective that will winkle out problems that are likely to arise in implementations, and then make sure that they are executed, and all of them, or the whole of those specifications are executed in a way which is supervised by qualified auditors, in order to produce results which not only show the performance figures, but also show the costs associated with achieving those performance figures. And by that means, eventually, if you're lucky and you get enough results, you can get comparability. You can say, if I get this from vendor X, then it actually is better than the results from vendor Y for some scale factor, for some sort of size of the data for a given workload. And that's the whole real point, is to actually get to those audited results. What we want to discourage, or what we wanted to discourage, is unaudited results from commercial companies or research groups sponsored by commercial companies, which look like they're the real thing, but they haven't actually been audited, and therefore we can't be sure. And we also wanted to avoid competitive benchmark reports, which were not approved of by the vendors concerned, because if obviously, if you have a certain, if we want results where people have honestly tried to get the best results out of the products concerned, and not results where we go, well, this untuned version of the open source edition of somebody's product is shit, right? Whereas our fantastic enterprise edition right over here, which we've spent 3 months tuning with all half our engineering group, it's fantastic. This is not a useful comparison. And we definitely didn't want the LDBC brand to be associated with either A or B. So that's what we were trying to achieve. So where did we end up? The first thing we did is we trademarked the phrase LDBC benchmark in several major jurisdictions. And I think India may be on this list. I didn't have a chance to anyway, we tried to get a big enough spread that it would be likely to stop significant problems in a serious sort of commercial organization that was trying to operate globally. Then we said we are going to encourage audited benchmark reports using LDBC benchmark standards, and we're at the same time going to allow and encourage innovation, borrowing, using bits of our specifications and so forth. But we want it to be very clear to anybody who's reading any kind of report or reference to those activities what it is that's actually going on. So the core of it is you can only use the term LDBC benchmark result to describe an audited result. And we have some definitions about what all of these things mean. And an audited result will be reported on the LDBC website. Now, how do we, how do we sort of enforce that? Well, what we say is, if you do the following things, which result in an audited result, we will license to you the use of our trademark for that purpose. If you don't do those things, you are laying yourself open to being pursued by LDBC for infringement of our trademark. And we will pursue that if we have to in order to protect the reputation of LDBC. So then we give some recommendations to people as to what they should do to avoid infringing our trademark. And that effectively means that if we then went after somebody and they'd followed our recommendations, we wouldn't have a leg to stand in. The court would throw it out. They'd say, yes, you've done what these people said and so forth. You know, you can't defend that, that you can't be gone after. So there's these two aspects. Either you do an audited result and then you can talk about LDBC benchmark result, or if you use our specifications in any other way, and that could be a derivative work, it could be partial implementation of a benchmark specification, it could be copying a piece of the data model from a benchmark because it's just handy and useful and you want to use it for any purpose you have. We like all of those things. It's open source. We want you to be able to do all of those things. You've got to say when you report that activity, this is not an LDBC benchmark result in some shape or form. And it could be just literally that as a little footnote on one slide in a presentation about everything you're doing, but we want you to actually acknowledge that you took something from LDBC, say that it's not a result, and briefly or fully, however you wish to do it, explain why it is not. What's the deviation? So you might say something like, you know, we've done this, but we didn't do it with an auditor, and we missed out 4 of the queries, and we haven't included the cost metrics. Now you know what you're dealing with. It's not an LDBC benchmark result, and this is why it's not an LDBC benchmark result. That's all you have to do, and it could be a very limited statement. It's up to you to make that statement and to sort of follow our fair use policy. If you're in the category of doing an audited result, the auditors have responsibility to make sure that you do all the right things to actually achieve an audited result. And the audited result, recall, no, let me make just one other qualification before talking about hostile benchmarks. In one of the aspects of this is fully performing specified benchmark. Every single query, every single condition, every single characteristic that's actually specified. The only variations are scale factor, and now what's being proposed is support category, I believe, becomes a reportable variation, right? So you might say, well, I've done it for these scale factors. You've got to report what that is. You're not obliged to do it for larger scale factors than you can accommodate, for example. And if you have got a support category, which is community, and you can't offer 24/7, you have to say so. But otherwise, you've got to do, everybody has to do the same thing. And then the footnote is about hostile benchmarks. And I just want to finish with this. So we have, this is an extract from the bylaws, and all of these policies are inside the bylaws of LDBC, and they're also on our website. The preceding slide had links, and they're links to the website. And we have this concept for the test sponsor, and that's the legal entity which submits an audited result. And a test sponsor, this is new, must be a member of LDBC at the time when the tests are conducted. So this means that if you've joined LDBC, you signed up to every single one of our policies, the way we do everything, you're under the scrutiny and, you know, of the rest of the membership and so on and so forth. So that sort of tightens things up as far as that's concerned. It also means that you've actually got to pay some money into LDBC if you're a company, because you're taking advantage of this work, and this work isn't free to generate and so on and so forth. If you're not a sponsor member of LDBC, you have to pay an additional audit support fee, which LDBC will set from time to time, because there's a lot of activities associated with supporting the execution of benchmarks. For example, we have canned, test data sets that have to be maintained and stored in cloud storage and so on and so forth. So we want to make sure that we're raising money proportionate to the activity that's happening around auditing, and that's similar to the fact that you pay an audit fee to TPC. The last bit is about the hostile bit. Test sponsors must have the written permission of the holder of the trademark of each component in a system under test, which is referred to in the test result. So that's a fancy way of saying, I can't take Neo4j and go and run an audited test on Neo4j or TigerGraph or any other database that we might be talking about, unless I've got the written permission of Neo4j, if it's Neo4j, or TigerGraph, if it's TigerGraph. And they can say, yeah, we'd love you to do it because we're actually paying you to do it and we think you're a great people to do tests on our product, or they might say, no, we're not going to allow that to happen at all because you're hostile to us. So this prevents...
Okay. I'm confused.
Okay, so am I.
So audited results will go up on an LDBC website.
They will.
And I'm a researcher,
Yep.
and I'm writing a paper, and I pull audited results published off the LDs, and I reference that.
Yep.
And I compare Neo4j to TigerGraph.
You can do that.
Because, and I don't need to ask Neo4j or TigerGraph because I'm taking the audited results. Okay, good. I want to make sure that was
absolutely the case. So this is all about when you're allowed to so you could say, I have looked at the audited LDBC benchmark results for Neo4j and TigerGraph. These figures are put next to each other in this table in my paper. The source for that is the website of LDBC, where I can see where you can go back and look at those results. 100% what we want to see happening. That's no problem with that at all.
Okay. Now I have to do my own result, and I want to compare it to those on the LDBC benchmark, but I couldn't get the money to get an audit.
Then you have to say, this is not an LDBC benchmark result.
On paper, I still want to compare it to the Neo4j and TigerGraph.
You can.
I personally would always ask you first.
You can.
Am I legal to publish that?
You can say, here's an unaudited, not an LDBC benchmark result with the following figures. Now your readers know what the status of your figures are, which is to say they're not trustworthy or as trustworthy as ones that have been audited. And you can make a comparison to audited results that have been published. No problem. But what we're trying to do is make sure that what you can't imply or say is, here are 3 sets of figures which you can compare.
Right. Got it.
Yeah. And we're therefore trying to induce people to get into the auditing business, right? And that's where we really want all of this to go. So it says there, for the intention, avoidance of doubt, the intention is to avoid hostile competitive audits and to ensure that audited tests are conducted only when there is no incentive to neglect available optimizations that would affect the performance of the system under test. So that's what we're trying to avoid. And that's where we ended up. Took quite a lot of debate and discussion to sort of refine it to that, but I think that's a reasonable outcome. So any other questions before we move on to more interesting technical matters? Yeah.
This is extended just using your data, the SMB data, and then you come up with their own queries because that's interesting data.
Yeah, if you take the data and go and do something with it other than an LDBC audited benchmark, you have to put somewhere. We use their data. That's the attribution. This is not an audited LDBC. This is not an LDBC benchmark test result. And here's what we did with this data, broadly speaking. So you explain your relationship to the work you took from LDBC. You're welcome to it. You're welcome to derive from it, but you're not welcome to represent it as anything to do with an LDBC benchmark result. Yeah. Cool. That's me.